Can you guys hear me? This is a huge room. It's kind of crazy. All right, as you might have guessed, I'm not Professor Snyder. Some of you know me. I'm Professor Shore. I'm Tim's wife. I was not supposed to be here, but our friend Professor Stanley, who was supposed to be here, has a kind of health crisis. So you have me at the last minute. I've been told to talk about fascism. So, what could be more fun than fascism? This is a long lecture period, so I'm gonna hope you guys aren't falling asleep by halfway through. I'll try to kind of look out and see how everyone's doing, and I'll try to tell some anecdotes or something if you look like you're falling asleep. What did you guys do last time? Where did you get them? What? Oh, Empire. Okay. Did you get to the First World War? Kind of, sort of? You're kind of, sort of in the First World War? Okay. All right. We'll try to figure out where to pick things up here. Let me say some introductory remarks on fascism. So when I told Professor Stanley that he had to get to the doctor this morning and I was going to be jumping in for him, he then sent me at midnight a manic series of messages like, make sure you tell him this and this and this and this. So I promised him that we would get him back at some point because he has lots of things he wants to tell you about fascism. In fact, fascism is Professor Stanley's favorite topic. And maybe I'll tell you a little anecdote about that to get you started. So Tim and I met Jason shortly before the first Trump election in 2016, which I realize from your point of view was like ancient history for a lot of you, because it was almost 10 years ago, which you were children. But from our point of view, it was like 2 weeks ago, and it was not that long ago at all. And how we met was that we were all teaching at Yale, which you might think that everyone just meets if they're teaching at the same place. But in fact, that actually rarely happens, especially if you're teaching in different departments. And Jason is a philosopher, and Tim and I are historians. And Yale, like a lot of universities, and perhaps especially a lot of elite universities, is, as one of my former department chairs says, a little socially challenged. So we might never have met, except that when Trump appeared on the political scene, in the fall of 2015, we were among the neurotic Americans who were very alarmed by this. And Jason, who is a philosopher, and I'm a historian, we were both teaching Hannah Arendt and Victor Klemperer. And those are two people I will tell you about later on today. When we kind of get more into fascism. But interestingly, it was our students, because some of them were taking both of our classes, who said, hey, you guys are teaching some of the same authors, maybe you should meet. So that was how I met Jason. Then it turned out we all had kids of similar ages. And then it turned out that Trump actually won that election in 2016. Which was a moment of kind of extreme devastation. I took my kids at the time were 4 and 6, and I kept them out of preschool and first grade, respectively, in the morning to go with me to vote, because it had been such a tense time that I thought it would be a good closure exercise. Now, my husband at that time was in Scandinavia. He had voted absentee ballot. He was sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win. See, sometimes he's wrong. Now you know the big secret. He is sometimes wrong. I mean, not that often, but this was kind of a big one. So I was walking with my kids to the polling place, and my son, who was 6, said, Mommy, if Hillary Clinton wins, all the grown-ups are going to calm down, right? And I said, yes, it's going to be okay. Like, I know this has been like a stressful period, but it's all going to be over today. You know, we're going to vote, we're going to calm down, it's all going to be okay. And then we wait in line for 2 hours because New Haven is completely incompetent, like many American polling places, at running an election. And we were voting, by the way, in the local high school, and the local high school is closed for the day because they're using it as a polling place. And so the teenagers there use that occasion to like have a bake sale and sell coffee and cookies to the people waiting in line as a fundraiser. And it was impossible in those 2 hours not to notice that the 15-year-olds taking coffee orders, you know, and selling donuts were infinitely more organized than the people running the election. In any case, as you know, that did not go the way it was supposed to go. And then one of my worst ever parenting moments was having to tell those kids the next morning, you know, that the bad guy won, which is not what you ever want to tell your little kids. And they knew, I mean, Talia she was 4 years old at the time, and she knew that her dad had the week before gone to Ohio very suddenly and unexpectedly to canvass for Hillary Clinton. And, you know, back to the neighborhoods where he grew up in the Midwest. We were living in Connecticut, and for those of you who don't know the American system that well, it's an electoral college system. It's winner take all in each state. So Connecticut was always going to go Democratic. There's no reason to campaign in Connecticut. You want to go to a so-called swing state where it actually matters. So Tim went to Connecticut Tim went to Ohio where he's from, and the kids knew that. So when I tell the kids the next morning, Talia says, maybe Daddy forgot to tell someone to vote for Hillary Clinton. No, it was awful. Caleb started crying. He's like, no, Mommy, no. You mean he won in Connecticut? He didn't win everywhere. Like, you don't want to tell your little kids that, like, the bad guys won. And then in the time that followed, I would say that everyone we knew kind of split up a little bit into two camps. Now, we live in such a bubble that we actually didn't know any Trump supporters. I mean, we knew a lot of Hillary Clinton supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters who thought they were having like a big battle before, like, you know, before this happened. But it wasn't like we knew Trump supporters and lost friends. But what happened and how kind of people kind of split into two camps was that, you know, there were the people, including a lot of our Americanist colleagues. So Americanist meaning not just Americans, but people who study America. Like Tim and I are Europeanists. We study Europe, you know, and in particular, we're East Europeanists. You know, they were walking around saying, okay, this is bad. This is very, very bad. But we're going to get through it. We are the world's strongest liberal democracy. We drink in our liberal democracy with our mother's milk. We have checks and balances. We're going to get through it. And then I felt like checks and balances became like a yoga mantra. It was like inhale, checks and balances, exhale, checks and balances. And I was like, oh my God, you know, we are like people on the Titanic saying our ship can't sink. Like, we've got the best ship, we've got the strongest ship, we've got the fanciest ship, like our ship can't sink. And the one thing you know as a historian is that there's no such thing as a ship that can't sink. I mean, I'm going to tell you this story about interwar Europe today, and like, there's a lot of sinking ships. And so the second camp was the neurotic catastrophist camp, you know, in which I put myself, who was like, no, it's not going to be okay. This is absolutely not going to be okay. So it's a very long introduction to how we got to know Jason, because Jason was in the neurotic catastrophist camp. He's the son of Holocaust survivors on both sides. His mother's a Polish Jew, his father is a German Jew. So there's kind of an overdetermined catastrophism going on. And his kids were also really small, and you know, his wife is a cardiologist working 24 hours a day, and he would like stagger over into our kitchen with boxes of pizza. New Haven, by the way, is famous for pizza. We have in New Haven the best pizza in the world. If you're ever in New Haven, pizza. Stagger over with pizza boxes, like stagger around the kitchen, the kids are like destroying the house, and our kitchen turns into a Soviet kitchen. There is this tradition in Soviet times that people gather in the kitchen, and tear their hair out, and obsessively pose the two great Russian questions. I should have put these questions on the handout, but I didn't know I was going to tell this story. I'm kind of improvising here. Well, anyway, the two big Russian questions are "Что делать?", which is also from Lenin and Chernyshevsky, what is to be done, and "Кто виноват?", who is to blame. And it's amazing, you can keep tearing your hair out and ask these questions again and again and again. So I felt like suddenly, here it is, it's November 2016, and our kitchen in New Haven, Connecticut has become a Soviet kitchen. It's like, we're like in Moscow in 1978. People are like coming by, opening bottles of wine, opening pizza boxes, kids are destroying the house, tearing their hair out, crying, like, what is to be done, who is to blame? Again and again and again. In any case, very long introduction so in that kitchen, and like this is like the next few years of our lives, like largely in that kitchen, as too much pizza gets eaten, and I'm still working off the calories from that pizza. And out of loyalty to New Haven, now that I've moved to Toronto, I don't eat pizza here, which is good. But in that kitchen, Jason wrote a book, How Fascism Works. Which was very much a product of the conversations in that kitchen. So now you know the story behind your reading. And in fact, the book is dedicated to all four of our kids, probably none of whom has read it yet. So Jason's kids, Emil and Elen, and our kids, Caleb and Talia. So I hope this will make you read extra carefully. But this was a product of our kitchen. And it's not a coincidence that a book called How Fascism Works got written in our kitchen in this particular time. All right, so that was a long introduction. So I'm both Jewish and a historian, and so there's an overdetermined, compulsive desire to narrate. So I'm continually telling stories, Okay, so Jason, who will get you here so you can see him at some point. You'll think I'm like very calm and normal once you meet him, because he's even more neurotic and hysterical. He's a philosopher. And so philosophers tend to he would tell this story of fascism very differently, because philosophers are kind of extracting from general principles. You're looking for, philosophers are always kind of like trying to get from the singular to the universal. Historians tend to operate at this kind of mediating level. We'll often use categories like class, nation, race, religion, ethnicity, generation. Generation's a very important category for me. I think the age at which you are when certain things happen is going to be very formative for identity. But in any case, if Jason were giving you this lecture about fascism, you would be starting with a lot of general characteristics and kind of moving from there. Because you are stuck with me and I'm a historian, I'm going to kind of start historically. I'm going to try to give you a sense of where it came from. Which is to say, this isn't the lecture he would give you, although I promised him I would try to get to some of his key points by the end. But what I want to do is kind of tell you a little bit about what I know, because it makes no sense for me to stand here and talk about things I know less well. I'm going to try to tell you the story of where fascism comes from. And I'm going to tell it to you largely from the perspective of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, which is the part of Europe I know the best, and the part that feels most intimate to me. And it, like historians like to say, it doesn't come from nowhere. Nothing comes from nowhere. And historians have a kind of infinite regression problem because wherever we start, something happened before that conditioned that moment. There's no tabula rasa place to start. Wherever we start, you're not actually starting at the beginning. But I'm going to try to take you through a little bit of where liberalism comes from and then where this backlash against liberalism comes from. Because fascism it's a political movement, it's a political system, a political phenomenon, a set of ideologies, and it's very much a phenomenon of modernity. There are all sorts of nasty tyrannical systems in the past. In general, the past is really bad. like lots of bad stuff happens. You know, there was a big discussion at Yale and other places maybe about 10 years ago about, you know, not triggering trauma and making classrooms safe spaces. And, you know, part of that, you know, I thought, well, that's what we should always do in the classroom. The classroom should be a place where people feel safe, where people feel like we treat one another well, we treat one another with kindness and respect, and like we listen to one another, and we don't. But it can't be a safe space in the sense of not dealing with disturbing material, because then we couldn't teach history at all. Like, it's just a mess. You know, I mean, Europe in the 20th century was a bloodbath. You know, and you know, my colleagues who work on the early modern period and the medieval period, like, human history is full of a lot of really grotesque, horrific stuff. Like, we just kind of can't get around that. So there were all sorts of horrible forms of autocracy and tyranny and authoritarianism. Fascism is going to be a kind of modern form of this. So another thing I just want to say as I preface this, fascism is a category, it's a concept. And we use a lot of concepts in history and the social sciences. We use things like imperialism, you know, or genocide, which is a relatively new concept. It's a legal concept. It comes from the aftermath of the Second World War. Colonialism, authoritarianism, concentration camps, you know, democracy for that matter. Like, there are all sorts of concepts that we apply that allow us to compare and relate different historical cases. Now, that does not mean that any two cases are ever exactly alike, because you only get something that is purely the same as you abstract it philosophically. Empirical life always has an irreducible singularity to it. Just like no two human beings are exactly the same, no two historical moments are exactly the same, no two political phenomena are exactly the same. Like, there are always going to be differences. So I'm going to try to give you a sense by the end of this lecture, if you're not totally sick of listening to me, which I would understand if you would be, about what fascism is as a concept and a category, you know, and why it's historically meaningful and why it's potentially in contemporary times still useful. And I would just say you want to be able to make use of that concept without fetishizing it. There was a huge debate going on during the first Trump administration. Can we call this fascist? You know, and I felt like that was kind of the wrong question. Like, yeah, like it was like because it becomes a kind of yes/no debate, and they're like, okay, well, this is similar and this is different, and this is similar and this is different. What you want to do is kind of try to understand how things are similar and how they're different. And so I'll try to give you a sense of that as well. And for those of you who are interested, I think I put this link on your handout. One of the things I did with some social scientist colleagues during the first Trump administration, at the moment when we were all in shock and terror because we Americans were taking kids away from their parents at the US-Mexican border and locking them in cages, we curated a forum that was called On the Uses and Disadvantages of Historical Comparisons for Life. And it was centered around this idea of fascism and the possibilities of comparison. You know, and what we learn by comparing, what we learn by applying these categories, what we learn by taking a concept, you know, and trying to use it to group phenomena that are going to be somewhat different but also largely similar. So just, you know, use your concepts without fetishizing them. Use them in a way that they're useful for you. For those of you who've had to sit through my intellectual history lectures, I like to think of these kinds of political categories like Kant talked about the concepts that are in our head. So Kant's epistemology was like the world comes at us with all this sensory data, and we wouldn't be able to make sense of it unless we impose certain concepts. So like we see this like red thing on the table, and we need the concept of apple to kind of make sense of what it is. And that doesn't mean that all apples are alike or any two apples are ever exactly alike. But he says cognition is a kind of synthesis of the irreducibly particular data we're getting from the world, with these concepts that we're imposing on them to make sense of them. So we need concepts to make sense of things, but we shouldn't fetishize them. Okay. All right, long introduction. I'm going to take you back to liberalism. Liberalism is, has Tim gone through liberalism? He didn't go through, okay, let's go through, so liberalism is a political philosophy that comes out of Enlightenment thought. Today we tend to talk about, liberal democracy, democratic liberalism. Democracy and liberalism are not exactly the same thing. And in fact, this was, I think, like one of the big mistakes we made after 1989 is assuming that democracy, political liberalism, and free market, capitalist, neoliberalism were all just somehow kind of seamlessly part of the same thing. I mean, they're actually kind of conceptually different. Democracy just means people get to choose. It doesn't mean they're going to choose the thing you think they should choose. People can democratically choose fascism, as we'll see. I mean, Hitler's going to come to power in a democratic election. People can, and often enough do. So democracy is just, in essence, the people get to choose. Liberalism is much more specific, and it's a political philosophy that's coming out of Enlightenment thought. And Enlightenment thought, which kind of has its center in France in the 18th century, is part of this movement into modernity, in which the short version of the story here is that you kind of push aside God, as the force pulling all the levers. You push aside God. You don't initially kill him off. The short version of modernity and modern thought is that it's all about trying to replace God, initially just by demoting God. Not actually by killing God off. It takes a whole century for God to get killed off, and that doesn't happen until Nietzsche in the 1880s. But back in the 1700s, you have God being kind of demoted. So God's there, God's nice, God created the world, that's all well and good, but he's not really pulling the strings. Really, the nice thing about God was that God kind of then left things up to us. So what Enlightenment thought does is it kind of moves God off to the side and puts center stage, like where I'm standing now, so maybe I should move over because, puts center stage human reason. So think about reason with a capital R. It's going to be it's really going to be this exalted thing, human reason. And so it's not just that you get rid of God and you put man there, but also this idea that we are special because we are possessed of reason, and there's a kind of exaltation of reason, a kind of rejoicing in human reason and the possibilities of human reason. So Enlightenment was a lot about the love of learning. They start this big encyclopedia project, and it was a kind of becoming enchanted and falling in love with the possibilities of the human mind, with the possibilities of our mind to learn about the world, to understand the world. All of Enlightenment philosophy in some ways was inspired by the natural sciences. People get very excited about Newton and the laws of gravity, and anytime I say anything about the natural sciences, I feel like everyone's going to see that I'm a charlatan because my ability to understand physics is very limited. But the idea is that you're systematically measuring things, observing things, researching things. It's not just that God said X and there's X. It's okay, well, let's do an experiment. Let's run a trial. Let's see what happens if you drop the apple. Let's see, and then you're going to observe on the basis of empirical evidence. So empirical means coming from experience. You drop the apple and the apple falls. That's empirical evidence that somehow the apple's falling, you're making the apple fall. And so the scientific method, the idea that you can observe, that you can note it down, that you can calculate, that you can categorize, that you can deduce laws on the basis of trials, this all comes from Enlightenment. And so science becomes the model of how you understand the whole world. And people get very excited about that. And there's a sense then that, we're possessed of reason, we're special, therefore we have the ability, and the right to create our own governments, that government should be based on consent of the governed, that we should not just be the subjects of monarchs who are given this power by some kind of divine right, that power should come from us, and we should be competent to choose because we're reasonable, rational people, and we're using our minds. And so, in some ways, the first premise of political liberalism, which is coming out of Enlightenment, is this idea of popular sovereignty, government based on the consent of the people, which is a very democratic principle. And then there are going to be other things, too, that we should have freedom from censorship. We should have freedom from serfdom, and from slavery. From being imprisoned or punished without due cause, the idea of habeas corpus, that you have to have a reason for detaining something, which has now just been eliminated in the United States, where they just take anyone off the streets they want. But all of these are classical liberal principles that, they kind of go along with free trade and enterprise, the notion of individual rights and civil liberties. So there's three things here about liberalism that I want you to put, in your head. One is reason. It all comes from this belief in reason. Two is this idea of a social contract, of a kind of consent of the governed, and rights and duties that citizens have. Citizen is going to be a revolutionary word. Before the French Revolution, there was no such thing as citizens. There were subjects of the king, which, and this is its use of subjects, which in fact is the opposite of how we philosophically use the word subject, because really you're an object of the king, you're a kind of possession of the king. But citizen is going to be a revolutionary word. You're going to then be someone possessed of rights. And this idea of progress. So now you have a kind of linear time. Because we are possessed of reason, because we are learning more and more about the world, knowledge is progressive. Sometimes you hear this as, standing on the shoulders of giants. But in general, knowledge is progressive. You show up as a scientist in the lab, you're not starting from zero. You're starting from where your predecessors left off. The knowledge is cumulative. And so we start to know the world better and better and better. And the idea is that as we know the world better and better, we can perfect it increasingly. So there's a kind of cheerful optimism, liberal teleology of progress that goes along with all of this. Okay. Obama, for instance, is like the classical Enlightenment figure in American politics. You guys may be too young to remember him as well, which is sad. But he was a classical Enlightenment figure in the sense that he believed in reason. Deeply believed in reason. When Obama won the election in 2008, I was at Yale at the time, and Yale is not like a very sentimental place, but my colleagues were crying. There was really this sense that something we never thought we would see in our lifetime had occurred. And for universities, I was also in Harlem the next day. I was walking through Harlem. And Harlem, which is a very largely African-American neighborhood, everyone was celebrating on the streets, one of our guys won. At Yale, everyone was celebrating one of our guys won. And it was one of our guys, someone from the university, someone who believes in knowledge, someone who believes in reason. And everyone was right. In that sense, both the people on the streets of Harlem and the people at the universities. Obama was someone who deeply believed in reason. He loved the university, he loved knowledge, he loved consulting with scientists, and he believed in it in that classical idealistic Enlightenment way. And he believed that through a kind of enlightened rationality, people could work together. He thought, okay, there are these problems. He comes into office and says, okay, we have very different feelings about abortion. I understand this is very tense. But let's find a place we can all start together. For instance, we can all agree, of course, that it would be in everyone's interest to reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies that result in abortion. So why don't we start by getting together and thinking about how we can improve sex education and access to contraception? He wasn't prepared for ill will and bad faith. He was thinking he could reach across the aisle because there would be ways everyone could work together. Okay, I understand, we have a clean energy problem. People don't want to be poisoned by global warming, and we have people who are worried about losing their jobs, and there are different interests. Okay, so let's get together and think about ways in which we can transition jobs. And we can retrain people for clean energy jobs. Let's try to find solution based on thinking rationally. And what he didn't have in his head, for all his intelligence, is the romantic rebellion against Enlightenment. Liberalism is a political philosophy that comes out of Enlightenment and has all the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of Enlightenment rationalism that come with it. And this could be felt very quickly, really by the French Revolution, I would say, by the end of the 18th century, that there were a lot of people who were saying, all this, rationality, all this, let's all, 2 + 2 = 4, isn't that great? All of what rational science wants to do is give everything that perfect clarity and certainty that you get in mathematics. So the model is always 2 + 2 = 4. People love 2 + 2 = 4 because it's always true for everyone, everywhere, at any time. It requires no empirical knowledge. It doesn't require counting jelly beans. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. It doesn't matter when you live. 2 + 2 is always 4. That's the standard of rationality. That's that's the holy grail. That's what you want to get to with everything. And then there's the rebellion against that that's really existentially thin. Not emotionally fulfilling. Boring. It doesn't speak to the irreducible particularity of my unique soul. What if I don't want 2 + 2 = 4? What if that is not satisfying to me? And the classic formulation of that is Dostoevsky's Underground Man, where he rants against 2 + 2 = 4. And he's like, what if that's just not what I want? What if it's to hell with that? So whereas the Enlightenment thinkers, who developed this philosophy of liberalism, they're going with the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Who we are is fundamentally thinking creatures possessed of reason. The Romantics are going to turn around and say, it's not cogito ergo sum, it's volo ergo sum, it's I desire, therefore I am. That what really makes us human is the particularity of our desires. And they cannot be reduced to a rational calculation. Very often we want things that are not good for us. And so Romanticism then comes in by putting passion against reason, by talking about the preciousness of the individual soul. There's a thinker named Johann Gottfried Herder, who is later going to be blamed for Nazism, which was probably unfair, but he was one of the Romantic thinkers that really starts to formulate a kind of Romanticism that would speak to the nation. And he says that just like individuals have precious, unique souls, each one, something specific unto itself, so do nations have unique souls. And his 3 doctrines are expressionism, which is just that we're here on earth to express ourselves. That art is the personal expression of the artist. Art is what it means to be human. And this expressionism is conveyed through words. And the words that people speak are precious, which means that the language you share with other people gives you a special bond with those other people. And Herder's idea of what gives you this special bond with other people, which is going to start formulating this idea that we'll later call nationalism, it's not yet a racial idea. Later on, fascists, and in particular Nazis, are going to take it on as a racial idea. But Herder is talking primarily about soil, about earth, about land, about where you're living and the trees and the woods and the forest. The Romantics love forest. Like their favorite thing is to be like in a dark forest during a storm. Big storm, thunderstorm, like dangerous storm, like that's their thing. So the soil and the language you share with other people gives you a special bond. It gives you a special bond with other people sharing this land and soil, and belonging is a human need. You know, and so it's important that we have these means to express ourselves, and that we have this sense of belonging, you know, and not everything is going to be compatible. You know, some things are going to conflict. So for Enlightenment and for liberal philosophy, and this was kind of one of the tragic flaws of liberalism, you're kind of assuming that all good things go together. And this was kind of Obama's tragic flaw, I think, and I'm very sympathetic to him. The idea that ultimately using a kind of rational, enlightened self-interest, all good things can be part of a whole, you can do good things for everyone. And that was a kind of classic, you know, the harmony of interest, the potential harmony of interest, is a classic Enlightenment premise. Romantics turn around and say no, like there are things that are just incompatible. There are values that are incompatible. Sometimes two men love the same woman, they might just have to duel and kill one another over her. I mean, that's tragic but necessary. That's like the classic romantic moment. And there was a whole dueling thing, and lots of people die in duels, and there's like a lot of Russian literature about it, and actually quite a bit of Habsburg literature and some German literature about it too. I'm not a big duel fan myself. Like people go into these duels and like they know that like they're either going to kill someone or they're going to be killed, and that it's completely absurd, but like that's the thing you do. So like if you forget about Romanticism, think about the duel. Okay, and then you get this very inflated language. So let me, so how Romanticism, so if Enlightenment is kind of at the origins of liberal political philosophy, Romanticism is going to be at the origins of national political philosophy, of nationalism. And every nation-building movement gets its own romantic poet. They're generally full of grandiose pathos and very overblown. I'll just read you a quotation from Adam Mickiewicz, who is Poland's great romantic poet. Okay, and he says, "For the Polish nation did not die." This is during the time when there's no Polish state. It's in the 1830s. "For the Polish nation did not die. Its body lay in the grave, and its soul had gone from the earth, that is, from public life into purgatory, that is, into the domestic life of those nations suffering from slavery. And on the third day, the soul will return to the body, and the nation will rise again and free all the people of Europe from slavery." So you've got some very grandiose visions, and this resurrection motif. Which hopefully you read the Codriano for today. I'm going to get to Codriano in 10 minutes or so. Like the resurrection motif. The nation is resurrecting itself. You know, and a lot of like Christ-like imagery, a lot of martyrdom imagery, cults of victimhood, all of these very overblown, lots of like tragic but necessary kinds of motifs. Okay, let me take you through just a little bit of this political history. So liberalism, kind of, its political realization of political philosophy, its concrete realization, comes in the French Revolution in 1789, the storming of the Bastille. And then in 1789, at the same time, you get the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which kind of codifies these liberal values. Individuals possess rights. You can't just throw us in prison, torture us, kill us, enslave us, etc., not let us talk. All of these liberal rights are then enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. What nobody was really thinking about at the time was that maybe man and citizen are not actually the same thing, and later on it's going to turn out that without citizenship, those rights can't be enforced. That's going to be one of Hannah Arendt's post-World War II principles. But in any case, that if 1789 is kind of this, you know, realization then of what liberalism was supposed to be as political philosophy. Now, it takes some time for liberalism as political philosophy to kind of travel from France through Europe into Central and Eastern Europe. By the time it kind of gets there, and I'm going to take you right into the Habsburg Empire, because it's kind of the center of things, and explodes, it's 1848. So a little more than half a century has passed. And by that time, when you get this whole year of kind of liberal uprisings, it's already blended with nationalism. And one of the things I want you to see is how nationalism is both a political philosophy that is coming out of a romantic rebellion against Enlightenment, but there's also going to be a sense in which it blends a lot of liberalism. Because if the idea is that individuals have rights to self-determination, so do nations. You can kind of extrapolate, or you can use it as a metonym or a metaphor. Like, if I have individual rights to self-determination, then, my nation does. And so at this time, huge parts of Europe and the world are living under these big empires, which hopefully you just heard about. So you've got the Habsburg Empire, you've got the Ottoman Empire, you've got the German/Prussian Empire, you have the Tsarist Empire. And so all of these, liberalism and nationalism have kind of blended together and are not so distinguishable by the time they get to Central Europe in 1848, and then they kind of explode in the springtime of nations. And let me read you an A.J.P. Taylor quote about the springtime of nations. So suddenly you have Hungarians and Poles and Croats and everyone kind of wants their own self-determined nation space. And everyone has their own romantic poet. This is very important, that you have your own romantic poet. You don't really get to be a nation until you have a romantic poet. The Romanians have Eminescu, and the Poles have Mickiewicz. And A.J.P. Taylor, the British historian, the British tend to be very sarcastic. He says, the nations who reappeared on the stage of history in 1848 were the creation of writers and still only existed in imagination. They were nations in which there were more writers than readers. So I always kind of think of 1848 that way, as nations in which there were more writers than readers, and there was something to that. Okay, basically those revolutions are for the most part put down, but the ideas are out there and they kind of percolate. In 1867, you get a kind of belated triumph of liberalism in the Austrian Empire, in which citizenship is expanded, the franchise is expanded, serfdom is forever abolished, surveillance of correspondence is lifted, there's a freedom of religion and equality of languages. So liberalism kind of comes in belatedly. Now, one of the things we're going to learn is that the liberals believed, they very much believed in education. It's part of this liberal teleology of progress, and they believed in, expanding the right to vote. What we're going to find out is that as the right to vote expands and more people get to participate, they're going to vote the liberals out of power. The liberals keep assuming that democracy and liberalism are synonymous, and that's just not true. That's also one of their tragic flaws. And that's very much true in the Habsburg case. The liberals kind of finally come to power in the 1870s in the Habsburg Empire, and they really push to expand the right to vote, and to increase citizenship rights, and then they're going to get voted out by the people they like. Because they keep thinking that we're going to get the masses on the political stage. And when the masses, these previously unpolitically engaged majority comes out on the political stage, they're going to come out on the side of liberalism. And that turns out not to be true. Okay, so now I'm going to take you to this kind of immediate precursor to fascism, which I'm going to call post-liberalism, for lack of a better term. And there's a great, if I had known I was giving this lecture, I would have made Tim put this on your syllabus, but I'm happy to email the text to Lee, who can stick it on its recommended reading. There's a great chapter in a classic book by the historian Karl Schorsky on Fin des siècle Vienna called Politics in a New Key, where he looks at three political leaders, activists in the Habsburg Empire in this post-liberal kind of pre-fascist moment. And he's trying to get at the moment when not just liberalism as political philosophy, but this whole climate of Enlightenment rationality breaks down, and something new appears on the political stage that is not yet understood by the people experiencing it. And he's gonna take you through three figures, two of whom are probably obscure to you at least, maybe all three of you who are obscure to you, but it's a very useful step in understanding how we get to fascism, to see these kinds of post-liberal political figures. So this is late 19th century kind of fin de siècle. And this is where we're going to see kind of nationalism and socialism kind of coming together in all sorts of blends. You know, some of these ideas are growing out of liberalism, some of them are growing out of nationalism. They're going to come together. We're now going to move into a politics of social engineering, in which the key categories are going to be nation and class. And everything is going to be a kind of combination, or choice about how you can identify within these categories of nation and class. And they're going to be the two big games in town as we move from the 19th into the 20th century. You can identify as a member of a class, a socioeconomic class, which for Marxism, of course, is key. I may come back later and talk to you about Marxism. I'll say a little bit about Marxism now. Or you can identify as a member of the nation, or you could kind of, do something in combination, which happens a lot. And this politics in the new key is going to be the beginning of a politics that will reach out of an exclusively political realm, and try to encompass all of life. And this is a key step to understanding what fascism means, that it's going to be a political movement that is not just about politics in the specific sense that it used to be. And there's an analogy to this if you've done the First World War. What was terrifying and what shook Europe so much about the First World War was not just that empires fell and the whole map of Europe was redrawn, but it was the first total war. So wars used to be, it's not like Europe had been so peaceful before. I mean, people were fighting wars all the time. But it wasn't really people fighting wars, it was armies fighting wars. And they were fighting wars on battlefields. The First World War is going to be a time where those wars come out and they're going to get their claws around civilians as well. They're going to take over all aspects of life. There's no longer going to be any space that's apart from war. It used to be like your army could be off fighting a war, you could just forget about it entirely. I mean, it wasn't you if you weren't in the army. It was a much more specific thing. And that's really an analogy to politics. Politics was something done by a very small number of people. You didn't have mass participation in politics. You would have a handful of political elites, and they would hang out at this or that cafe or this or that parliamentary room, but most people were not involved in politics. So what this stage of politics in the new key is so important, is that it's the moment when politics becomes total, just like war becomes total. Suddenly it's going to take over other aspects of life. So suddenly political parties are going to not just be like private elite clubs that a small handful of white men get together to smoke cigars and drink brandy and play cards and discuss something political. Now it's going to be they're going to have their own clubs, they're going to have their own newspapers, they're going to have their own sports teams, they're going to have their own hiking outings, they're going to have their own youth clubs. They're going to try to encompass all aspects of life. And this totalization of the political sphere is very important. So let me just take you through briefly the three guys who Karl Schorsky profiles, and it's a really brilliant chapter. This book, decades ago when it was published, won the Pulitzer Prize, and I think it's held up very well. The first is someone named Georg von Schöner, and my native German-speaking kids would be cringing at my accent here, who in 1885 starts something called the German nationalist movement. And Schöner, like a lot of these post-liberal figures, were political figures who begin in liberalism and defect, who get dissatisfied, which is another interesting historical phenomenon. the people who are disillusioned with something and they're going to go to another side. This happens a lot. And he becomes more and more, he develops a kind of party that is based on pan-Germanism, so not just the Habsburgs, but also the German speakers elsewhere, that is then going to integrate a big dose of anti-Semitism. And one way to understand anti-Semitism and how it's going to play out in Europe is it's now going to be a kind of racialized anti-Semitism. And when we talk about this with my American students, I would say, in order to understand the role that anti-Semitism is playing here in Europe, you have to think less about American Jews and more about African Americans, because it's more of a racial issue. And the analogies work better with how white Americans were treating black Americans at the time than they do with how Christians were treating Jews, which Judaism was often considered Judaism, not Jewishness, as a religious category. This is not going to be a religious category in any exclusive way. It's going to be a racial category, this integration of anti-Semitism. So this kind of ethnic nationalism that Snyder is going to use against something that's just Austrian patriotism. And let me read you Shorsky's quote on Snyder. A curious combination of gangster, Philistine, and aristocrat who saw himself as a militant knight redeemer of the German people. His whole platform just kind of coheres around anti-Semitism, which allows him to be simultaneously anti-capitalist, anti-Catholic, anti-liberal, anti-Habsburg. And he's going to set a precedent for kind of making a fetish out of anti-Semitism. Now I'll just take you briefly through the second anti-Semite who's kind of more popular as a historical figure, Karl Lueger, who is very much a Viennese politician, and he was a Catholic. He starts the Christian Socialist Party, which is also anti-liberal and anti-Semitic and anti-capitalist and anti-Marxist, who he also begins as a liberal. He integrates relatively more social welfare, although he's an anti-Marxist, but you try to kind of you try to have a kind of social welfare program that is going to run against the Marxist. But the important thing for our purposes is how he's going to mobilize anti-Semitism. And he has a famous quote that people still use, which is, "Wer Jude ist, bestimme ich." I determine who is a Jew. And that also becomes very important to this idea of, I determine who we're going to divide into us versus them. And us versus them is then going to be a very important motif of fascism. I won't go into so much detail about Lueger, but in 1897 he becomes mayor of Vienna. And he's going to be one of the original demagogues who is able to, in a populist way, mobilize the masses. And the important thing here, as we move into, and now I'm going to talk to you about the Dreyfus trial, is this is the moment when the masses are going to come out onto the political stage. And fascism doesn't make sense without this. Okay, I'm now going to jump you from Vienna in part to Paris. So there's a guy in Vienna named Theodor Herzl, an assimilated Habsburg Jew and a journalist, a writer. He is sent to Paris. Remember, Paris is the homeland of liberalism. It's the capital of liberalism. It's the center of enlightenment. It's the great revolutionary city from the French Revolution. So what happens in Paris is that in 1894, there's a trial. And there's a trial of someone named Alfred Dreyfus, who is a military captain. He was born in 1859. He's still relatively young at the time. He is a wealthy, assimilated French Jew. So he is a Jew who has assimilated, the family has assimilated into French society at the highest levels, and he's a military officer. Now, at that time, there is a French spy in the German embassy who discovers that there has been some act of treason within the French military, because the German military attaché in Paris has these secret French documents. So somebody in the military gave these French documents to the German attaché. There's some traitor. Someone has betrayed the French military. Now, at this time, the French military was conservative, it was monarchist, it was Catholic, it was anti-Semitic. Dreyfus is suspected of this, seemed largely because he's a Jew. There's no significant evidence. He's put on trial, tried by a French court-martial in 1894. He's convicted. He is sent into exile and solitary confinement in this obscure place called Devil's Island, which is some tiny island off the northeast coast of South America. I'm not sure why Devil's Island in particular, but he was sent to Devil's Island. Okay, Dreyfus protests that he's innocent, but there's overwhelming support for the conviction, both in the French press and in the French public. And there's this excitement about Jewish treason and espionage and having caught the traitor. The issue comes up again 2 years later in 1896 when an army colonel discovers evidence suggesting someone else was the real spy, and that's going to lead to a division of French public opinion. Very famously, the writer Émile Zola writes a text called J'accuse, I accuse, sticking up for Dreyfus, and this is going to be a long-standing split in French public opinion. To make a long story short, Dreyfus was innocent. He is eventually going to be exonerated of all the charges. But in the meantime, the significant thing that's happened, and this was a key moment, both if you read Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which you should all read, Origins of Totalitarianism, it's a key moment for Arendt, and it's a key moment for Theodor Herzl, who is the Jewish Austrian journalist covering this trial. And what strikes Herzl about the trial is not just that there was a traitor in the French military, that this guy Dreyfus is innocent and he was accused, but that suddenly you have masses of people coming out on the streets and shouting, "Death to the Jews." So this is the moment when the masses enter the historical stage, right at the turn of the century. Now, the liberals have been waiting for the masses to enter the historical stage. They've been trying to cultivate the masses, trying to educate the masses, trying to enlighten the masses so that everyone can come out on the historical stage and participate in politics. And now here they are. Masses of previously politically unengaged people are on the streets, but they're not there on the side of the liberals. They're there shouting, "Death to the Jews." So this moment is going to be decisive for the whole world in various ways. It's also an extraordinary example of historical contingency, because you can imagine that this might not have happened. I mean, there was a real traitor in the French military, that's why those documents were discovered, and Dreyfus could be unfairly blamed. There might not have been, right? Things could have gone another way. Theodor Herzl, who is completely assimilated, very loyal to the Habsburg Empire, German language writer, he sees those masses chanting "Death to the Jews," and he's like, that's it. Liberalism failed, Jewish emancipation failed, assimilation failed. Modern Zionism comes from that moment. Herzl's then going to turn around and write The Jewish State. He's like, okay, the liberal universalism did not work. I guess everyone needs their own national ethnic state, because otherwise everyone's going to want to kill us. And the failure of Jewish emancipation that strikes Herzl is a symptom of the failure of liberalism. Liberalism was universalist. Nationalism was particularist. Herzl was a universalist who is converted to particularism through the trauma of covering the Dreyfus trial. And that it is, and not just for Herzl, but it is truly the symbolic moment of the failure of liberalism. Okay, the third and last profile in Shorsky's chapter is of Theodor Herzl, who is also very interesting. Maybe I can read you a quote about Herzl. Zionism is post-liberal mass politics. it makes sense in the context of Herzl's responding to people like Lueger, to people like Snyder, to the people he was watching, to the people he was surrounded with, to watching the Dreyfus trial. It was a post-liberal nationalist movement, like these other post-liberalist nationalist movements, that was responding to it and had all of the dangers and vulnerabilities and weaknesses and desires that were inherent in the other ones. And like other ones of these movements, Zionism was out not just to create a new state, but to create a new person. And this is also where fascism is going to take off from post-liberalism, that it wasn't, politics used to just be a very limited, narrow range of politics. Now it's going to encompass your whole life, and it's ultimately going to be about social engineering, not just the society, but the self. It's going to be about creating a new kind of human being. There's going to be a new man, a new Jew, a new Soviet person. The idea is you can actually re-engineer human beings. And there were left-wing versions of this too, which I'll leave to the side for the moment. What happens with Marxist post-liberal movements? Let me just say a couple things in conclusions about post-liberalism, and I'll jump into fascism. These are all movements that in some ways begin with liberalism. Snyder, Lueger, and Herzl all start out as liberals. And they all defect because liberalism, they're going to feel, has betrayed them. These people who feel betrayed is also a kind of historically political phenomenon. My late and very dear friend, Tony Jett, who's also very close to Tim, and Tim worked on this last book with him while he was dying of ALS. In the last years of his life, was known very controversially as an anti-Zionist, in particular for a piece he wrote in the New York Review of Books called Israel, an Alternative in 2003, in which he was accused to many people of being an anti-Semite, which he didn't expect, because from his point of view, he was a former Zionist. He was driving tanks in the Golan Heights in 1967. Zionism, he felt, betrayed him. It was not what it was supposed to be. It took a racist turn. It was not like, it was not supposed to oppress other people. And the passion that Tony had for anti-Zionism only makes sense in the context of having been a believer and feeling that it betrayed him. Herzl's passion for the creation of a Jewish state only makes sense in having been a passionate liberal believer, a passionate believer in liberalism, and failing that it betrayed him. And that's a general key to understanding a lot of these figures in history. The people who feel betrayed, the people who threw themselves heart and soul into something, and it was not what it was supposed to be. Okay, so so there are a lot of dramatic ideological political evolutions. Liberals who become apostates to liberalism. We're moving into, with this post-liberal transition into fascism, a politics of charisma, a politics of cults of personality, a politics of the masses who can be mobilized by leaders who are working with cults of personalities, a privileging of the collective over the individual, a notion of totality, the idea that these political groupings now, they're going to have their own newspapers, their own schools, their own swimming pools, their own sports teams, their own exercise classes, blah, blah, blah. Like, it aims to take over all aspects of your life. Now you're going to summer camp, you're going to Boy Scouts, you're going hiking on the weekend. Your whole life is going to be encompassed by these kinds of political groups. This creation of a new human being, this social engineering on a grand scale. Okay, this is going to be radicalized by the First World War and the fall of empires. You've kind of gone through the First World War. Tim is probably much more succinct about these things. You see, I'm sure you can already imagine the difficulty of our lives, just about by how long it takes me to get to any point, and he's like da 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 da. Really, the hardest thing to do with him is go grocery shopping, because I'm still examining the different Apple options, and he's already ready to check out. Okay. When World War I finally ends, and it doesn't really end in the East, but like say November 1918 it ends, the Americans who come in kind of at the last minute but get an oversized say at the negotiating table, are going to institute Woodrow Wilson's principles of self-determination. Self-determination is basically, in its crude form, going to mean that nation and state borders should coincide. So the Romanians should get their state, and the Hungarians should get their state, the Austrians should get their state, blah, blah, blah. Like many ideas, this is one of these things that works much better in theory than in practice. It sounds good. Self-determination sounds good, but really in real life, people are mixed up. People aren't just cleanly all in one place and kind of nicely divided by, geographically logical borders. And people are intermarried, and, people are don't even necessarily define themselves in the ways you think they should define themselves, and blah, blah, blah. So the idea of self-determination, which is kind of marrying liberalism and nationalism, sounds good, but it's going to end up to be kind of a mess. What it leads to is a new map of Europe. So these four empires have fallen: Tsarist Empire, Prussian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and you have a whole new map carved out of Europe. And the idea is that borders are now going to be redrawn to accommodate people. After the Second World War, then we say that peoples are moved around to accommodate borders. Neither one of these things goes brilliantly right. You have a new map of Europe. All of these new successor states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, to these empires, some of which had existed but in different boundaries, they're all going to be set up as liberal democracies, as nation states with careful protections for minority rights. So the minority rights protections were supposed to be the thing that kind of offset the problem that you can never actually cleanly divide people along these borders. The short version of that story is that liberalism, these liberal democracies with their minority rights protection as they are set up in these new states, last approximately 5 minutes. It falls apart really, really quickly. There was a failure to reckon really deeply with the contradictions between liberalism and nationalism. It's also true that liberalism is kind of a latecomer by the time it gets to Central and Eastern Europe, and basically if you go out to the movies 2 days in a row, you've missed it. What happens then in interwar Europe is everyone is set up as a liberal democracy, with the partial exception of Czechoslovakia, that lasts 5 minutes, and the story of the interwar years is a polarizing political spectrum, in which the left is becoming more radical. I may be brought back at some later point when Tim is traveling again to tell you about that. The right is becoming more radical, and the center is going to disappear. Now, where fascism comes in here is on the far right side of this radicalizing political spectrum. And as usual, I'm talking too long, and I want to get into the Romanian case in a moment. But let me say a little bit about just this right side of the political spectrum. I'm going to call something the old right and the new right. So you've got the old conservative right, coming out of the First World War and coming out of some kind of mixture of these post-liberal movements and just old conservative traditionalist monarchists. You can kind of think of this, if I put this in American terms, I use too many American analogies and now I'm in Canada, but you're going to have to suffer through it. So if you think of the old right as the white guys who were hanging out at their private golf clubs that didn't allow in minorities or Jews or blacks or anybody else. And they're sitting there playing golf, or I've never played golf, I guess you stand sometimes, but otherwise you drive around in that little thing and then play golf. I've always wanted to drive one of those little cars, so I've never actually played golf. Okay, but let's say golf clubs. When I was a kid growing up in Pennsylvania, the big thing was that the fancy golf clubs still didn't allow Jews, and there was a lot of talk about that. in the Jewish community. I mean, I was a kid, I was not interested in golf, I didn't really care, but other people were interested in golf. But anyway, so think of those guys in the golf club. They're drinking brandy, they're smoking cigars, they're playing golf with one another. They're racist, but they're not out on the streets, beating people up racist. They wouldn't get their hands dirty. They're not that kind of racist. They're just their private elite country club kind of racist. So you can kind of think about the old right in that with that kind of sensibility. So kind of elitist in a kind of old world, way, but not the people who are actually running around beating people up on the streets. And then, to follow up on my American analogy, think about the Ku Klux Klan who actually runs around with their white hats and actually lynches people. The old right and the new right kind of map onto that imperfect analogy. The old right are the guys with the golf and the brandy and the cigars at the country club, and the new right are the Ku Klux Klan guys who actually lynch people. The fascists are going to be the new right. Fascists are going to come up on the new right. And one of the tragic moments is that it will take the old right some time to realize that the new fascist right is not just a more energetic, younger version of themselves. They're not really going to realize for a while what they've gotten into or what they have allowed to fester. At a certain point, they're going to get scared, but it's going to be too late. But fascism is going to come from that. So one interesting historical question is this kind of Hegelian question about quantity turning into quality. So those guys at the golf club or whatever, I don't know, they don't play golf that much in Europe. I don't know, whatever they were doing at their European clubs, drinking brandy and smoking cigars, were they just a slippery slope to fascism? Were they with their elitism and their social hierarchy, and their traditionalism, and their we keep people from other groups out of our fancy private club, is that just a step on the way to fascism? Is it just a question of degree of racism? Or is fascism a fundamentally different phenomenon that in some ways comes from a different place? And so that remains one of these historical questions. I thought of this again to throw you into another contemporary analogy, which you also won't remember because it was 2008, when Sarah Palin came on the political scene. John McCain was running against Obama, 2008. He chooses Sarah Palin as his running mate, who is this young Alaska governor with basically no real political experience. John McCain was the old right. Very much old right. I'm a person on the left, I never would have voted for him anyway, but he was not crazy. He was still part of a conversation you could participate in. There were things he believed in that made sense even if you disagreed with him. Sarah Palin comes on the scene. She lives in a completely fictitious world in which anything is possible, and she will happily rile up a crowd to lynch someone. And you could feel that immediately. And as soon as she came on the scene, I was terrified. I'm we're back in interwar Europe. This is the old right and the new right. But Americans don't understand it because they haven't quite had this exact same experience. And I think McCain himself understood it at a certain point and got scared. I think she scared him at a certain point, and I think when he lost, he was relieved. I remember listening to that concession speech, and I think a big part of him is relieved. He didn't intend to unleash what he did unleash. And I think Trump is impossible to understand without understanding what Sarah Palin then, this total unhinged, there are no more limits. This, you could feel the violence. You could feel the violence that she had injected. Okay. I'm going to take you... I have a little bit of time left. I'm just going to take you into one case study because I love talking about the Romanian fascist movement. It's my favorite one to talk about. So I'll just take you into one case study on the Romanian fascists, and then I'll try to end with some general characteristics of fascism, which is what Jason really wanted to talk to you about. Okay, so interwar Romania. I'm kind of fascinated by Romania, and the literature coming out of it was fantastic. So again, you've got a state that had existed but not in quite the same form. New borders, one of these states created at Versailles, set up as a liberal democracy with minority rights protection. Not everybody is happy about the minority rights protection. You have this guy, Nikolai Yorga, and his buddy, Alexander Kuza, who are nationalist, anti-Semites, scholars. Like they support limiting Jewish participation at universities. They support glorification of the Romanian past, but they're not yet really totally, unhinged. And they form this anti-Semitic party, the Democratic Nationalist Party, just before the First World War, and then it's going to continue after the First World War. Now that one of these young participants, this guy Codreanu, Cornelia Zelia Codreanu, who I have this on your handout, which you can, which Lee uploaded, so you can look these names up. Oh, Codreanu was also in your reading. You got him. So he comes from Kuza and Yorga, but he's going to decide they're not going far enough. So you can see this, like right here, this kind of split from the old right to the new right, or this young generation feeling like something new is necessary. So he's going to begin his career in Kuza's League for the Defense of the Christian Nation. In 1923, the Romanian government votes to amend the constitution to give Jews Romanian citizenship, which in principle they were supposed to do years ago according to the minority rights protection, but they were taking their time. This outrages Codreanu. He really has an issue with the Jews. And the Jews here, of course, it's a projection. This is in American history, this is largely African Americans who fulfilled this role. At the moment, the LGBTQ community is largely fulfilling this role. There's this projection of some kind of outside group that needs to be purged. The young Codreanu is outraged that Jews were given citizenship, and decide that this is a betrayal. And he and his friends, who are very young, at the time, these guys are in their 20s, if they're even 20. And he and 4 friends in 1927 create something that is going to be based initially on a vision that Codreanu has of the Archangel Michael. And they'll create something called the Legion of the Archangel Michael, which will become known more colloquially as the Iron Guard. So now we go from a kind of old right, but increasingly, with radical elements, conservative, racist, nationalist party, into something that is quasi-mystical. And there's a lot, the Romanians really get the mystical element of fascism. They're seriously into the visions, the nation as an organic, mystical entity, the exaltation of the primitive, of the peasantry, of the dead being resurrected. The idea that anti-Semitism is not just a prejudice, it's a holy cause. So this notion of elaborate conspiracies. Conspiracy thinking is very big with fascism, this notion that there are these demonic forces out to get you, pulling the strings at some kind of elaborate. So anti-Semitism wasn't just like a prejudice, it was a kind of holy cause. Jews were lurking behind everything that was bad, that was anti-Romanian. The principles of the Legion of the Archangel Michael came with faith in God and our mission, our love for one another, our fellow Romanians, songs, there was a lot of singing. They were defining a political platform in ways that used a lot of imagery about the mystification of the nation, about resurrection, but in terms of concrete programming, it was largely all negative. They were anti-Semitic, anti-modern, anti-Western, anti-decadent, anti-industrial, anti-capitalist, anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-parliamentarian, anti-democratic, and anti-foreign. So there's this kind of mystical, metaphysical, resurrected essence of Romanian nation that was supposed to come out. Codreanu decides that political programs are not necessary because this country is going to ruin, he says, not for lack of programs, but for lack of men. And if you read his remarks on democracy, that very much kind of encapsulates his democracy is bad, it destroys unity. We need unity. We need this coming together of individual selves into a kind of single self. Disunity means death. There is really a death fetish with Codriano and the Iron Guard. There is a kind of necrophilia thing going on. This sense that democracy would make millions of Jews Romanian citizens. How could that be when they don't represent the nation? They don't represent the historical destiny. They represent being financiers and part of an international conspiracy. There's a lot of soil, but now it's soil and blood, connection with the dead. The ultimate goal is resurrection. And you get this in one line, Codriano writes, the nation's ultimate goal, the survival of the nation, the resurrection of the nation, means that all methods are valid, even the worst. So this idea of that Germans spoke about Entgrenzung, this idea of limitlessness. There are no longer constraints. The old right had constraints. This new fascist right is going to willfully have no constraints. So there's going to be a kind of obsession with death, with sacrificial martyrdom, with cult-like rituals, with blood brotherhood. Let me read you some quotes from one of these songs. Legionary, do not fear that you will die too young, for you die to be reborn and are born to die. With a smile on our lips, we look death in the eye, for we are the death team that must win or die. Death, only legionary death, is a joyful wedding for us. The legionary dies singing, the legionary sings dying. So there's a high level of death cult here. Codriano had a real flair for drama. He liked to ride through villages on a white horse. This also makes me think of the Ku Klux Klan and the White House. There's something about white horse, white hat. He would ride through these villages on a white horse. He'd be greeted as a hero. Peasants would come out of their houses and pour buckets of water in the path of the horse, which is an old custom for prosperity. One of their publications explained, the finest aspect of legionary life is death. Legionary death has nothing in common with ordinary death. By legionary death, the legionary becomes engaged to eternity, is translated into legend. Members of this group would address one another with the greeting, long live death, long live the legionary triumph. Death was the ultimate romantic act. There was also this rejoicing in violence. And I'll just tell you a couple anecdotes here. Some of these legionaries, these Romanian legionaries, go to Spain to fight for Franco. This was a big thing. If you were a communist, you went and fought on one side. If you were fascist, you went and fought on the other side. There's a liberal student leader at the University of Bucharest who then makes some disparaging remark about a legionary who dies fighting for Franco, and he is put on trial by the Iron Guard police. So again, these groups start having their own security apparatus, their own paramilitary force. He's put on trial by the Guardist police, by the Legionary High Forum, and they sentence him to 25 lashes with a wet rope. So by this point, in the 30s, the Iron Guard kind of has all the trappings of a kind of parallel totalitarian society. And the Romanian government essentially tolerating the situation. In 1936, this is the last gruesome anecdote I'll tell you, the legionary leader, Mikhail Stalescu, breaks with Codriano. They have a falling out, so he becomes a kind of legionary dissident. He has appendicitis. He's in the hospital recovering from an appendectomy. His former blood brothers descend upon him in the hospital. They shoot him 120 times, then proceed to chop up his body with an axe, dance around the pieces of flesh, pray, kiss each other, and cry with joy. So there's a lot of death cult, a lot of blood, a lot of violence as purging, violence as a ritual. Okay, let me say a little bit about the philosophers. There was a young generation of philosophers in Romania at the time, born, say, between like 1905 and 1915, often called the generation of 27. Extraordinary set of minds. Like, as an intellectual historian, I've long been fascinated by these guys. Constantin Noiga, Mircea Eliade, Mihail Sebastian, Emil Cioran. They had a mentor, this guy named Ne Ionescu, a philosopher who has been described as a kind of consummate seducer. And they suck up philosophy, including a lot of German and French philosophy, very precociously. You've got a lot of Nietzsche, Bergson, Heidegger in a kind of volatile combination. There are stories about the teenage Emil Cioran who would go to Transylvanian brothels with a copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in his pocket. It's a very big book. They were like Dostoevsky's underground man. They were self-consciously looking to push beyond reason. So they were intellectuals trying to get beyond reason. They were embracing irrationalism, and not thoughtlessly, but very self-consciously. They were looking for a philosophy of irrationality. In Mircea Eliade's 1927 spiritual itinerary, he writes this manifesto saying, only love, hatred, and passion offer the possibility of transcendence. And he says, if a good idea ever had a deadly result for a nation, then in the case of Romania, that good idea was democracy. Politics needs to stop being politics and become mysticism. You need a new man who can create new values. Cioran writes, man should become a lunatic, risking everything for the sake of his dangerous fantasies. Now, Mihail Sebastian, who's a fascinating character, was a Jew. And he was friends with all these guys as they're becoming anti-Semites. And he kind of stays friends with them. But he's also like taking notes about this like obsession with anti-Semitism that is directed also against him. And he writes a novel about it, and he says, a character in the novel tells an autobiographical narrator, any act of violence is good. Down with the Yids is idiotic, agreed. But what does it matter? The point is to shake up the country a bit. Begin with the Jews if there's no other way, but finish higher up with a general conflagration. The sense that everything needs to be burned up in a fire and rebuilt, reborn, resurrected. This purging, cleansing impulse. Cioran says man should stop being or becoming a rational animal. He should become a lunatic, risking everything for the sake of his dangerous fantasies, capable of exaltations, ready to die for all that the world has as well as for what it has not. And then he goes on to say, I wish I were a cannibal, less for the pleasure of eating someone than for the pleasure of vomiting him. He goes to Germany. He's watching the Nazis come to power in 1933. He writes, I like the Hitlerites because of their cult of the irrational, their exaltation of vitality as such, their virile expansion of energy without any critical spirit, without reserve, and without control. So in order to kind of understand the draw, you have to like this vitalism, the vitalism and the self-conscious irrationality, that there is something beyond reason that can take you to a higher state. Now, of the ones who do not go to the Iron, basically one by one, all of these philosophers join the Iron Guard. With the exception of Sebastian, who's a Jew, and Eugene Ionescu, who it turns out also has some Jewish heritage, and will emigrate. Some of them will end up being killed. And Eugene Ionescu is going to end up emigrating to France, and he's an absurdist playwright in addition to being a philosopher. And he writes a play called Rhinoceros, which if you haven't read it or seen it, there's a film version with Gene Wilder. You guys should all stream it because it is a theater of the absurdist allegory of fascism that is still very on point today. And it's a story. The American version is 1974. It's with Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder. It's really quite crazy. It's autobiographical theater of the absurd, and it tells the story through this allegory of human beings turning into rhinoceroses in a kind of invasion of the body snatchers way, what it meant for Ionesco to one by one watch his friends turn into fascist. And it's kind of fantastic. So maybe I'll read you a couple lines from that. So some of these characters are saying, the human individual is all washed up. You're just a ridiculous sentimentalist. It's time for change. And someone else is saying, don't we have to fight it? And then someone says, no, if you ignore them, they won't bother you. You've got to just learn to detach and see the funny side of it. I don't want to accept it. I want to act. You have to move with the times. Oddly enough, you get used to it. Practically everyone has a friend or relative who's become one. And so one by one, you watch all these characters turn into a rhinoceros. It's like, it can't really be summarized so well, but you'll appreciate it. And then in his memoirs, Ionesco kind of tells the story in normal prose. He says, university professors, students, intellectuals were turning Nazi Iron Guard one after the other. At the beginning, certainly, they were not Nazis. We were some 15 people who used to get together to discuss, to try to find arguments opposing theirs. It wasn't easy. From time to time, one of our friends said, to be sure, I don't agree with them, but on certain points, I have to admit, for example, the Jews, etc. And this was a symptom. 3 weeks later, this man would become a Nazi. He was caught in the mechanism. He accepted everything. He became a rhinoceros. Toward the end, we were only 3 or 4 to have resisted. So you'll see sometimes, even in present day, this reference to they became a rhinoceros. The rhinoceros is a Eugene Ionesco reference, and it comes from this play, which is kind of fantastic. All right, so how does this story end? The story ends with the king of Romania in 1938 declares a dictatorship. He arrests Codreanu with some of these other guys. At some point, Codreanu and 13 other Iron Guard leaders are shot while trying to escape from prison in 1938. Then King Carol gets nervous. He's going to, at some point, abdicate in 1940 in favor of Marshal Ion Antonescu, who is also kind of old right figure, like Carol. And Ionesco is going to make an alliance with the Iron Guard. Now, Codreanu's dead, but not all of them are dead. And he makes an alliance during the Second World War with the Iron Guard and inaugurates what is then called the National Legionary State in September 1940, largely under Nazi auspices. And then in January 1941, the Iron Guard forces in that state get very excited and conduct their own pogrom against Jews before the Germans even make them do anything. They murder about 120 Jews in Bucharest, and they hang their bodies on cattle hooks in a Bucharest slaughterhouse. Sorry, I said that was my last gruesome anecdote was going to be the last one, and then I threw another one at you. And at that point, Antonescu's like, okay, I can't deal with the gruesomeness. Like, okay, I might not like Jews, I might not mind violence, but this kind of orgiastic violence is a little bit out of control. So he's eventually going to use his army to crush the Iron Guard. But Antonescu and the Iron Guard in this national legionary state, the pogrom, the bodies on the cattle hooks, it's a kind of classic moment of the alliance between the old right and the new right. Mircea Eliade, who will later end up at Chicago and try to forget about his fascist past, wrote at some point, "We were unwilling as young people to have people shout at us, 'Don't play with fire,' because we knew very well we were not playing." Okay, let me spend the last couple of minutes going through some of these typical characteristics of fascism. Let's see, which I probably should have spent more time on, but in general, and these cases are going to vary, we're talking about a worldview, a movement, a system or government. It's going to advocate extreme nationalism in some form. You can also think of it as, in some ways, an anti-modern phenomenon of modernity. The state and/or the nation will become a kind of quasi-religious, mystical entity, an obsession with unity, a fear of modernity's perceived threat to the integrity of the nation. There's a lot of rejection of materialism in favor of metaphysics. So when we get to Marxism and communism, there's going to be a big materialist impulse. Here, we're like, concrete reality is not going to be important. You can rise up to the level of the metaphysical. There's a real fetishization of racial hierarchy, of hierarchy in general. Equality is deadly. Equality is deadly. Hierarchy is somehow blessed by a kind of social Darwinism, of survival of the fittest. There are these cults of strength. Jason could talk to you a lot about this insecurity about masculinity, anxieties about sexuality that are parts of these cults of strength. I always feel on so much shaky ground talking about insecurities of masculinity being a woman, but there's a lot of obsessive, today we would say toxic masculinity, but there's a lot of kind of obsessive cults of strength, embedded racial hierarchies, fetishization and idealization of racial hierarchies. I'll read you a couple quotes from Mein Kampf, which Hitler wrote in prison between 1923 and 1924. The result of all racial crossing is therefore, in brief, always the lowering the level of the higher race, physical and intellectual regression, and hence the beginning of a slowly but surely progressing sickness. The lost purity of the blood alone destroys happiness forever, plunges man into the abyss for all time, and the consequences can never be eliminated from the body and spirit. All really significant symptoms of decay can be reduced to racial causes. So this obsession with degeneration and decay versus resurrection, the need for purity, the need for hierarchy, cults of victimhood, a division of the world into us versus them, a very strong scapegoating impulse. Them always has to be scapegoated, be purged, be somehow gotten rid of to preserve the purity of the nation. What in German is called the Führerprinzip, the leader principle, the cult of the leader, the cult of personality. Whatever the leader says is somehow, mystically mandated. The mythologization of the past, this living in a fictitious world, in which reality is not a constraint. Hannah Arendt talks about how what makes these kinds of modern political lies different is that old-fashioned political lies used to be like tears in the fabric of reality. And the careful observer could spot the place where reality was torn and sewn back together. By the time you get to fascism, it's no longer a tear. It's a total reconstruction of reality in such a way as to be seamless. There's no seam to find. So totally fictitious world, an exaltation of emotion over reason and anti-intellectualism, a kind of worship of violence, of law and order, tendency to ritual humiliation, all sorts of fun things like that. Sebastian writes about how this blooding and mocking of Jews is public entertainment now. So these are all kind of classic characteristics. Maybe, let's see, I think I'm running out of time. I was going to try to get you through some other things, but maybe I won't torture you anymore. Let me Let me feed you one more quote by Victor Klemper, who's one of my favorite writers on the subject and one of Jason's favorite writers. Victor Klemper was a philologist, a scholar of literature, a German Jew who survives the war and the Holocaust actually in Germany, in large part because of his non-Jewish wife, who will go to great lengths to save him. And he keeps a diary. And he's a philologist, so he's paying attention to language. And in addition to his diaries, he wrote a book called LTI, Language of the Third Reich. And he analyzes Nazi language and how it started to infiltrate people's thinking. And he has a famous quote that I like to use. He says, "Words can be like tiny doses of arsenic. They are swallowed unnoticed, appear to have no effect. And then after a little time, the toxic reaction set in after all." So there's when Jason comes, make him talk to you about language, and fascism and how that language starts seeping in. Let me just leave you with one more thought. So years ago, like probably 20, 25 years ago, I was teaching at Indiana University, and I gave a lecture on Romanian fascism. And one of my very sweet, very ingenuous students from Indiana, said after the lecture, he raised his hand and said, "Professor Shore, that guy Codriano you told us about, he sounds like he was a lunatic." And I said, "That's a very perceptive observation. He was indeed a lunatic, but you should never discount the historical roles played by lunatics. Lunatics play major historical roles all the time." Okay, I'll leave you with that cheerful thought and go do something happy today.